This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and today I'm joined by Tom Brown. Hello, Tom.
Good morning.
Is this the third time you've been on the podcast? It's certainly the second, but I think it might even be the third.
Yeah, second or third. I remember talking to you about gladioli.
We
but
did.
I can't remember. Can't remember anything else. Maybe the second then.
Yes, and Tom is the head gardener at West Dean, which is the most fantastic learning centre in not East Sussex, but West Sussex, about an hour and a quarter from me here. And I first met Tom, just to give a little bit of background, at Parham, also over in West Sussex. And both Parham and West Dean have lots of threads in common, partly led by Tom, which is that they're great. Tom has led a fantastic trials and tests, which is actually how I met Tom. We went and first did a gladioli piece. I interviewed Tom for the Telegraph, and then we did sweet peas, we did staking, we did alliums, we did loads, didn't we?
We did. Do you remember the first one I think we did was sunflowers?
Oh,
I think that might have even been 2015.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then I've been to visit you in the trials that you've done at West Dean. We did species tulips, we've done hyacinths, we've done sweet potatoes.
Yeah.
So we've done quite a few sort of collaborations. But the thing that is a theme of both the gardens that Tom has been head gardener of is incredible greenhouses. And so not at all surprisingly, Tom has been asked by DK, Dorling Kindersley, to write the most incredibly functional, practical, hand-holding book called The Greenhouse Book. So, Tom, tell us, how did that come about? I know it was out this spring, actually, wasn't it? And I read it on the way back from Crete, actually, I read it. Anyway, tell us about how the book came about.
Yeah, as you say, I was approached by DK to write a book, but they wanted it very much more sort of on a domestic point of view. So we've got 13 large Victorian glass houses here. Yeah. And that isn't necessarily the most relevant for people at home. So the whole premise was that it was taking all of those skills and techniques and then sort of boiling them down into a domestic situation. And that involved building a greenhouse from scratch and sort of exploring the world of greenhouses in its entirety. So everything from lean-to greenhouses to cold frames, some DIY projects in there, which made me absolutely terrified because I struggled to change a light bulb, let alone build a raised bed or a cold frame. So
you look very relaxed when you're doing it in the book. You wouldn't.
Yes,
I wouldn't.
I look very relaxed. Yes, indeed, that would be the drink. But no, I really enjoyed it, and I kind of saw glass houses in a different light through this book. So I think with my work, there was always that pressure to deliver a certain look, but the glass house at home, or anybody's greenhouse at home, is such a haven. It's a sanctuary for you. Mm. You're in charge. You can potter. You can have the radio on. And actually the intensity of gardening and horticulture that can happen within a greenhouse is immense. And I really enjoyed being able to do lots of different aspects of horticulture in a very small space that was purely mine. And everything in the book was part of the journey. So even things like making nettle tea and comfrey tea, creating that and then feeding the plants throughout the summer with that. So everything in the book is my journey through that year. So everything is sort of as it was. There was nowhere to hide with this book. And if you remember, last summer was the most wet and cold summer that we could possibly have. So I worked with the wonderful Jason Ingram as a photographer. And the pressure towards the end of the summer when he was coming to take pictures of ripe peppers, ripe melons, the sleepless nights that involved, but we got there in the end.
I mean, it's so, it's one of the most asked questions when I'm teaching is, I'm lucky enough to be getting a greenhouse for my Christmas, come birthday, come anniversary, come whatever present. And where shall I site it? What's the best place and what's the best size and all those sort of practical things. So they are all dealt with in Tom's book. But will you just maybe, Tom, give us, I don't know, your top sort of 5 things that you think is absolutely critical to choosing and then siting and then making your greenhouse?
Yeah, of course. The nice thing about greenhouses is there are so many available now online, sort of secondhand marketplaces. So you can pick up a greenhouse relatively cheaply. When it comes to siting it, I always think people should consider the winter where the greenhouse is, because in the summer to have the greenhouse at the far end of the garden is no hardship to take a wander down the garden to the greenhouse. But in the winter, where you want to be tending these plants on a regular basis, if not daily, you need to have them quite close to the house to make it practical to get to it. And also consider a hard path, because if you're walking backwards and forwards on your lawn, you're soon going to have a nice brown track where you've been walking through. And really, light is one of the most important things with greenhouses. So avoiding the shadow of the house, avoiding the shadow of any trees, and putting it into the sort of the best lit position you can in the garden with a little bit of shelter as well. And one of the things that I thought was particularly enjoyable about this process was the greenhouse throughout the year. So we always associate the greenhouse as being a summer venture, tomatoes, cucumbers. And in the winter, it almost becomes a bit of a TARDIS for all the junk in the garden. You know, the patio furniture goes in there, the barbecue, you shut the door and you forget about it. Whereas the greenhouse is great for salads, cut flowers, things like stocks and ranunculus and florist anemones. Absolutely love that cool, bright environment. So trying to get people to engage with their greenhouse 12 months of the year was really important to me.
That is so true. I bang on about that quite a lot. In fact, I've just done a podcast about it, and I just think, it's amazing how many people, when I've got a group that I'm teaching, and I say to them, "Okay, how many of you have got a greenhouse?" And obviously, hugely varying numbers, but a good proportion of people put up their hands. And then I say, "And how many of you use it as much between May and September as you do between October and April?" And whereas I would have had quite a good show of hands, I then have 1 or 2 people. And it is amazing, isn't it, that people just don't think that it's a space that will enhance your inside life by having these things just protect. How many degrees does a non-insulated coal greenhouse protect to?
I think with a little bit of supplementary heating, I mean, I use a lot of the terracotta candle heaters and a small paraffin heater, because I think if a lot of people rent their properties and they can't go to the expense of digging great big trenches for cables to get electricity to it, I think it's perfectly feasible to sort of keep it frost free with those small heaters. One of the biggest killers in the winter is the wet too. So if your greenhouse is slightly on the drier side, plants have got much more resilience to the cold. But I think what's really challenging in a greenhouse is those persistent cold days. If you get 3 or 4 days in a row of sort of -4, -5, that can be incredibly challenging to get plants through. But it should certainly give you a good few degrees. And one of the other sort of aspects that I looked at was hot bin composting. And there's the sort of heat that's generated from that can just help to keep the worst of the cold off, but also grouping plants. If you've got some particularly tender plants, like some of the tender bananas or dahlias or cannas that you've got in there, okay, they're on the dry side, but put them in the back corner, wrap those with bubble wrap. So you haven't actually got to protect the entire structure. Just those plants that need it.
Yeah, but that's so interesting about the hot bin thing, because I remember reading about Heligan and how they'd grown pineapples. I mean, obviously in Cornwall, they have incredible light levels and they have a longer growing season, but they used great sort of mass of manure, didn't they? Which was then generating the heat, which
Yes.
from, I mean, we have farmyard manure here because we're on an organic, we've got a herd of cattle. And it's steaming with heat in the winter months. And so you can see the heat that it's generating. So you found that made a real difference on a domestic scale greenhouse.
Yeah, and certainly partitioning the greenhouses. So the large greenhouse that I built this year, it had a back partition, which I use for propagation in the spring. But during the winter, I used that for overwintering. So I only heated a small volume of the greenhouse. So yeah, you can be quite canny with where you position plants, particularly when it comes to sort of that heating side of things.
And as we're moving from the summer into autumn, etc., if you were to focus on, I don't know, maybe 5 plants that you think everybody should put into their green, or however many you want, really, but what would be your tips?
I really enjoy potted bulbs, planting those in the autumn, things like those hyacinths, as we know, under glass. The perfume is just so intense. And one of the things that we battle with as gardeners, I suppose, during the winter is the wet and the cold. And the lovely thing about growing under glass is you can manage that quite happily. You're only going to expose those plants to water when you choose to add it, unless you've got a leaky greenhouse, of course. But bulbs were really joyful. I think salads, some of the mustards are really fantastic through there. I love, ever since my parent days, growing stocks from seed and having a succession of stocks that you can cut for the house or even bring the pots in to the house as well. Ranunculus and anemones work tremendously well. And some of the herbs too. So things like mint, you can divide a clump of mint and put it in a pot and have that in your greenhouse, because that will bring the mint on a little bit earlier. And I did a lot with supermarket parsley and some coriander towards the end of the winter, where you can sort of divide those pots of parsley up and plant them in raised beds. So you get that early flush of herbs. And ultimately with greenhouses, we're trying to extend the growing season. So you can push that growing season into the winter, sort of January, February, whereas outside you'd obviously be a lot more restricted with those crops until March, April time.
And sort of commoner mistakes. So I reckon both of us would conclude that overwatering is more likely to be a mistake, particularly as we go into the sort of less active growing months. So don't worry so much about underwatering, in a sense. You know, it's the overwatering that will cause more problems. But also tell us about pests and diseases and how you manage things like whitefly and etc.
Yeah. I mean, I love the phrase that it's very easy to sort of revive a slightly dry plant, but almost impossible to revive a sodden one. So, you know, you can always add a little bit more water, but you can never take it out. And I'm a terrible overwaterer. My wife always says to me, I sort of tend to kill with kindness. And we always think watering is love, don't we? And actually, it's quite the opposite during the winter. But with pest management, it can be massively challenging trying to maintain pest levels in a greenhouse, particularly throughout the summer months. But you need to start early. You need to keep a relatively clean environment. I use a lot of the SB Invigorator spray.
Yeah.
And the moment you see a small build-up of pests, to give that a quick zap with this oil-based spray, just to keep those populations under control. I think the idea of having a sterile environment in the greenhouse isn't necessarily a healthy one. So a few pests isn't the end of the world. You're still going to get your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your cut flowers. It's if those pest levels build up to a point where they start to compromise the plant. And I think one of the joys of greenhouses is that daily check, you know, constantly interacting with your plants, with the environment. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is it too drafty? Let me just check for those pests. Oh, there's a few whiteflies on this tomato, so I'm just going to use my finger and thumb and just squash those. Or maybe start to introduce some biological controls to bring those levels to a manageable point. I think once pests start to overrun a plant, red spider mite on cucumbers, for instance, is very difficult to then bring them back again. So keeping them at a manageable level from the get-go, I think, is vital.
Yes, and also ventilation. So you mentioned that. I mean, obviously in the winter, you don't want all the doors and vents open because windburn and damage is a thing. But I definitely have found with our greenhouses here that we had 2 blocked ends of our first greenhouse, and we did have vents in the roof and some sliding doors on the front, which were quite big. But as soon as I actually introduced a sliding door on the west-facing side, it just made such a difference to all the things like damping off of my seedlings and all those sort of fungal diseases. And I find being actually quite unkind in a way to things and growing them harsher than I would instinctively do has made much healthier plants.
Yeah, very much. And you can, again, with that partitioning, if you talk about winter protection, it's grouping plants that are suitable for those conditions. So I think we often think of cucumbers and tomatoes growing quite happily side by side, but actually the environment that they want is quite different. So your cucumbers, your melons, your aubergines, They want a more tropical environment, sort of damp, humid, slightly darker, whereas your chilies and your peppers want a much drier air and much more movement. So if you can partition your greenhouse, or even by putting a sheet of bubble wrap in there just to sort of give you those zones of different conditions, I absolutely agree. Ventilation is key, and a nice bit of gentle air movement makes for a very healthy growing environment.
Absolutely. So any other tips that you feel is absolutely critical, that sort of either common mistakes that people make or just things that you've learned through the process of having your own domestic greenhouse on your back doorstep?
Yeah, I think try and be in your greenhouse as much as you can. See it as a bit of extension of your home. It's your environment, and you're managing that environment. So you build an awareness and an instinct for the space over time. I think working with a number of gardeners that work under glass, it's all about building that instinct. Do I need to add a little bit more ventilation? Is the wind direction in the wrong direction? Is it going to then blast the cold air into the greenhouse? Therefore, I'll keep the doors shut, but I'll open the side vents. Does it feel too damp? Does it feel too dry? So just spending time in your greenhouse and your plants, I think is really important. I think you've got to have a strong marriage before you build a greenhouse. I think that's vital as well. Having built this greenhouse from scratch to a deadline was incredibly stressful, but we got there. And having a bigger greenhouse that you can afford or you've got space for, because you're always going to fill it. And it can provide everything from food to cut flowers in one space. But yeah, I found it eventually very joyous process of having that space that was purely mine. And you can start off with successes. We talk about allotments, people taking on an allotment and then becoming very discouraged because they're overrun with weeds or plants aren't growing. If you take a quarter of your allotment and master that, and then take another quarter and just keep building until you're very confident, because the last thing any of us want is for people to be discouraged for a lack of confidence. So I'd say the same with greenhouses. Take on some very sort of straightforward crops, even if it's some dwarf daffodils in the winter, and grow them in pots or for cutting. Try a few tomatoes. And then once you've mastered that and you feel confident, then start to expand into some maybe more challenging cut flowers, like some of the ranunculus, or some of the more challenging crops like melons and cucumbers. But I found there was a tremendous amount of pleasure to be found from quite exotic veg that are relatively straightforward to grow in a greenhouse, and they enjoy that very warm, extended season. So things like sweet potatoes in containers are really good under glass. Lemongrass you can grow easily from seed, or you can get some of the stalks from a supermarket and pop them into a glass of water. And the root plate at the bottom of those stalks will soon sprout roots. They can be potted, and they love a greenhouse environment, as does root ginger as well. Wash your root ginger when you get it home, because sometimes it's been treated to stop it sprouting in a supermarket. So give it a rinse, but you can grow that in a container. And these very exotic vegetables that we think might be difficult to grow are easy, and they don't get very many pests at all. So actually, you can experiment with those and get quite a lot of success and have something ever so slightly different.
Yeah, well, there's so many good tips in this chat, but also in Tom's book, the Greenhouse book. It's absolutely stuffed full of suggestions for beginners and projects, and to people who, I mean, like me, I've been gardening with a greenhouse now for 30 years, but I found there were lots of things that inspired me. So thank you, Tom. Lovely to chat. And what's next for you?
What's next for me? So I'm doing a lot of work at Westdean with growing plants with no fertility. So I'm using a lot of sand and recycled concrete, believe it or not, to grow a number of umbellifers and perennials to try and be more resilient to the extremes of climate, whether that be heat or flooding quite often in the winter. So the frustration is, I think 10 years ago, we thought that Mediterranean plants were the answer to our problems with these dry summers. But when those particular plants sit underwater for 2 or 3 days in the winter, they often then turn their toes up. So it's finding plants that have got the resilience to both we're working on. And one I think you'll approve of is roses for cutting.
Very good.
We've put a new border in the wall garden where we're trying to grow a few floribundas for cutting, which should be quite enjoyable. Yeah, always on the move. And I'm working with the Sweet Pea Society at the moment with their new varieties. So keep having little chats with myself to slow down and start saying no to things, but it hasn't quite sunk in yet.
Oh, great, Tom. Lovely to chat. And let's link up again and talk about one or other or all of those subjects.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks so much for listening to me, Sarah Raven, and Grow Coquita Range, joined this week by Tom Brown, talking about his new greenhouse book. Next week, I'm joined by my original co-host, Arthur Parkinson, and we're going to talk about one of his really big passions and one of the things he does really, really beautifully, which is not only garden, but pick things to press and then make fantastic cards and paintings, really, from nature that go on the wall. And any of you who follow Arthur on Instagram will know that pressing flowers is just something he does so beautifully. So join me then and he'll give us all his tips.
You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.